This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Petrak, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Petrak. And if you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you are in the right place because we interview the brightest stars from all corners of the pharma universe. And today's guest would certainly fit that description. Pritesh Gandhi, the CEO of TellBio, a company that has an integrated diagnostic and therapeutic platform. Sounds exciting. Pritesh, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you.
Oh, yeah, me too. I mean, when I met you, I think you were a regional director of MSLs at Alexion. And
Yep.
from our first conversation, I knew that the sky was the limit for you. And it's been so fun to watch your career continue to skyrocket. And so I'm not surprised at all that you're now a CEO. But tell us, what's it like being a CEO?
Yeah, who would have thought, Michael?
I would have.
I guess you could have been a palm reader because I never thought I would be where I am currently. It's fantastic. My role currently as CEO of TellBio is it's great. We started the company from scratch. We in essence acquired the patents from MGH and from Harvard Medical School, and in essence started the company from ground up and are co-developing a diagnostics platform for cancer metastasis, as well as a therapeutics platform for cancer metastasis. As we know, in cancer is the second leading cause of death globally, and 90% of the patients die because of the spread of cancer. So what we really want to do is try and halt that spread of cancer and help patients to potentially have better outcomes.
It's so true. I mean, because I mean, I've seen that in my own life with loved ones. The first cancer's cured or stopped or in remission, but then years later it rears its head again and it's metastasized.
Yeah, there's been great progress on the therapeutics front, and of course, more needs to be done on the diagnostics front to try and evaluate patients real time in terms of cancer progression.
I got to think being a CEO, wearing so many different hats has to be challenging. What's the most challenging thing about it?
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? I mean, every day is different. Sometimes every hour is different. You don't know what you're going to face, whether it's a manufacturing issue, whether it's a in vitro study, and the data don't quite make sense, and you try and understand the data set. Whether it's on the financing side, and understanding where you are in terms of your cash runway and when your next financing round should be, working together with your team and the board, and of course managing a board is also super important. But I think all in all, it's very exciting. You wear multiple hats, and communication is key with all the stakeholders,
And we're going to
internally
dive
and externally.
We'll dive back into communication later, but I gotta get your perspective on this. So many of our listeners keep asking me, why is pharma in such a funk right now? What's the big challenge? And from your CEO seat, let's talk about the state of pharma. What is causing such a challenging time?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can think about this at a macro level and then dive a little bit into the sector level, right? I think on the macro level, of course, as you think about inflation and interest rates, I think that has made a major impact in terms of where the money is being invested currently. And if someone is getting a 5% interest rate on a CD or in a money market account, which is relatively safe without risk, then you would potentially put your money there. And of course, pharma is high risk. 90% of the products don't make it to commercialization, so that's super high risk. So I think at the macro level, there's that idea of just where things were from an inflation and interest rate perspective, and then of course, secondly, there was a lot of scrutiny on the FTC side as well with respect to mergers and acquisitions. So there was, of course, an impact there in terms of potentially cash return for investors. So I think that those are the two macro kind of headwinds. On the sector side, I think there was a lot of enthusiasm during the COVID time, clearly, A lot of work went into COVID and developing the vaccines, which was fantastic to do in such a rapid pace for a pandemic that we haven't seen in our generation. And that of course enabled saving millions and even potentially billions of lives across the globe. Having said that, with that, there was a lot of money that went into the sector just because of just the speed of development and what the vaccines did for humanity in essence. But with that, there were ideas that were in essence being financed. I mean, truly ideas without data. And I think that really perpetuated a bubble where lots of money was going into companies with strawman ideas and with a paucity of data. Over time, I think those companies haven't panned out for a variety of reasons, whether it was because of the science or because whether it was the people or because it was lack of strategy or what have you. And I think now it's getting better. I see green shoots. Inflation has been tamed. Interest rates have come down, of course, on the macro level with a 50% a 50 points reduction in interest rate. And in addition to that, I think on the sector side, M&A is starting to pick up. Some of the data that we're seeing right now are pretty compelling. I think the GLP piece on the metabolic front is huge. The advances that have been made in Alzheimer's have been huge. Inflammation continues to be a hot area. Oncology is still a hot area. So I think, with the election, that's going to be yet another little bit of an overhang. But I think we have two candidates on the election cycle that are well-known entities, either way, right? So I think 2025 will be better.
Oh man, I hope you're right. I hope you're right. And I really like the concept of the COVID bubble, because what I observed, a lot of the jobs that I fill as a recruiter, they're relying on patients being enrolled into clinical trials. And sometimes it's not a go in and get one dose. Sometimes it's multiple times. And going to a hospital during COVID to get a cancer treatment or whatever treatment it was, it was hard for companies to get patients enrolled and then keep them compliant on their study. So what it seemed like is a lot of companies fell behind the timeline, which means over budget. And do you feel like that contributed to the impediment of innovation?
Absolutely. I think, the clinical operations teams at companies and the clinical development teams at companies had to be very creative in terms of, retaining the patients that were in studies and then also recruiting new patients, right? In the context of, administering the investigational agent in a hospital setting. There had to be measures that had to be taken into place to ensure the safety of the patient, and of course, the healthcare professionals as well. So there had to be some, creativity there. I think on the other front too, I think on the FDA side, I think the FDA was inundated, to be completely honest, in terms of the number of requests that were coming in from, of course, companies that wanted to file INDs or even NDAs outside of COVID. I think the FDA had been super understaffed because everything that they were assessing during that pandemic was really kind of focused on COVID. That was the first priority. Everything else was in the back burner. So I've heard many companies where, they were kind of told, hey, this is not kind of COVID related right now. We're not looking at your application, right? Or there could be some, potential reason for having a clinical hold, right? Because there was not enough data and there was not that opportunity to engage and collaborate and partner with the FDA because it was not COVID related. So I think the FDA was definitely also understaffed and, rightfully so too on the FDA front too. I mean, they had to prioritize COVID.
Yeah, right. It's not like COVID didn't hit them too. I mean,
Yep.
yeah, and I really hope you're right about, things looking better in 2025, but I just don't know if that's really going to, normalize because we still have this IRA looming, from a CEO seat. How is that impacting long-term budgeting?
Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly important, right? And I think access is going to be huge. There's a lot of scrutiny as it pertains to, IRA and PBMs and going direct to patient. Companies are now thinking about going direct to patient, right, on both the diagnostic side as well as the therapeutic side. I mean, and you've seen this, right, especially with the large pharma companies who are trying to, change healthcare system delivery and kind of obviate some of the obstacles that are being seen by potential PBMs. And I think with respect to oral therapies as well, specifically with respect to IRAs, I think that's going to be a challenge. But I think overall innovation is going to be super important, and coming up with medicines that have clinically meaningful differences for patients is going to be supreme. To be able to get access to these therapies, both on the patient side and on the payer side.
Yeah, as a CEO, you're not just managing in the day, even though there's fires that you're putting out. You also have to manage for 5 years from now. We've talked about the IRA, we've talked about access. What other bumps in the road do you think pharma is facing down as we look forward?
Yeah, I think, honestly, as we start to really think about how companies are getting financed, there's going to be definitely more scrutiny in terms of the science and the biology and data, which I think is a good thing, honestly, because now there's going to be monies that are going to be going into companies that where there's a potential quote unquote there, right? Now, of course, still very high risk, right? But I think it's going to be backed by data and science. And I think with that, there's going to be innovation. And, I personally see there's a lot of areas for innovation. I think one of the key areas right now that is a little bit bumpy, right, is also gene therapy, right? If you just think about gene therapy and potentially one-time administration for some devastating diseases, but the cost associated with that is something to consider, right, in terms of what are some potential long-term impacts with respect to that therapy as it pertains to whether it's safety or whether or not it's efficacy, right? So I think that needs to be addressed, right, in terms of bringing forward gene therapies for patients. I mean, I think the science is there. It's been proven. I think the long-term data in terms of efficacy and safety are going to be critical to ensure, adequate access to patients and to make sure that, the prices that are being commanded are actually justified.
Do you think AI is going to have an impact in this as you look forward?
Yeah, I think this is going to be interesting, right? I think, AI is a big topic, right, Michael, with respect to a variety of different things, whether it's, it's education, whether it's on the government side, whether it's on the pharma and biotech side. Biology is very tricky. Biology evolves, right? I think there are a variety of different ways of thinking about integrating AI. On the diagnostic side, it makes a lot of sense, right? Which could potentially also enable therapeutics. So, we are currently looking at circulating tumor cells to understand which patients are going to potentially have, progression of cancer metastasis. And we take images of these circulating tumor cells. Over time, you could create a library of these images that are digitized, and you could train an AI model and an algorithm to really enhance and augment efficiency to pick out the circulating tumor cells and to say these are circulating tumor cells, these are normal white blood cells, and that efficiency could be super incredible. So I think the diagnostics piece, AI has been leveraged and has been used. I think to enable therapeutics, you could potentially look for specific epitopes and specific pathways within these cells to understand whether or not a specific therapeutic would potentially work in targeting that particular cell. So I think that is going to be the next wave of really understanding personalized medicine in the oncology space. I'm just giving you one example of what this could potentially look like on the oncology space, which is super exciting.
Yeah, I want to talk just a second more about what you said about the diagnostic that you guys have. Because one of the big AI models is predictive AI. Is it could it be predictive? Like here are the circulating cancer cells. can we predict where they're headed or where they'll end up metastasizing? Is that?
Yeah, I think that to be super critical and important, right? I think it depends on, what these cells have on them, right? How are they being protected, right? So are they being engulfed by platelets, for example, and are they being shielded or cloaked, like, Harry Potter, for example, right? Are they being cloaked so that they can evade the immune system, right? And understanding how that mechanism happens in terms of how circulating tumor cells adhere themselves to platelets to potentially mask the immune system, and whether or not we could potentially disrupt that, right? Based on specific ligands that you see on either on the platelets or on circulating tumor cells. So you could potentially think about prediction, right? Of saying, okay, fine, if these cells are not being masked, right, then you could potentially think about an immunotherapy that could potentially work and predict that immunotherapy would work, right? That's an example. The other example is, of course, there's a big push right now in antibody drug conjugates, right, in oncology. And so you could potentially look for these circulating tumor cells and whether or not they actually have that protein on that circulating tumor cell, whether it's a HER2 or a TROP2. And then you could potentially predict whether or not that particular antibody drug conjugate could work in that patient based on whether or not you see that that epitope on that circulating tumor cell. So it could potentially be predictive in terms of whether or not a therapy could work.
So it's so interesting. We could keep talking about that. One of the things I think is really interesting about TellBio and what you're trying to do as a CEO is you're sort of working in the therapeutics and the diagnostic space at the same time, and they're both experiencing major headwinds. Are the headwinds different? I know we talked a lot about pharma. What about on the diagnostic side?
Yeah, I mean, the headwinds are pretty, substantial, and we have to talk about that. I think you have to think about, what's happening in the sector too, right, on the diagnostic side. Of course, there's, the big players like Quest and LabCorp, which are fantastic, right? But I think as it pertains to the oncology space, and as we talk about liquid biopsies, there's a lot that is being done, right, with respect to circulating tumor DNA, with circulating tumor cells, and extracellular vehicles. I think that's the way we kind of think about liquid biopsy. So when we think about liquid biopsy, it's an umbrella term of these three specific areas of circulating tumor DNA and CTCs and EVs. And I think each of them have their own unique, advantages and disadvantages, right? And the way I see it, right, on the diagnostic side is to really think about where you could get the biggest bang for the diagnostic in terms of sensitivity and specificity, right? I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done with companies like Exact Sciences and Grail. But what we are really focusing in on are patients that have an established diagnosis of cancer, right? Because I think screening individuals for cancer, I think, is a very tall task, in my opinion, right? And the reason for that is, you could potentially find something in a circulating tumor DNA that's circulating in your blood, and then you tell that individual, I don't call them a patient because you're screening for cancer, and you say you may have cancer, but you don't know where that cancer is, right? You're going to start looking for it, and then there's a lot of work that goes down in terms of surveillance on monitoring that individual for where that particular cancer is and try and target it. So I think on the diagnostic side, what we have done is we have said, okay, fine, you know what, we are really going to focus on patients with an established diagnosis of cancer to understand whether or not that cancer is progressing. And I think your sensitivity and specificity is much higher. So I think the headwinds there, you have to be very careful to make sure that when you're going after screening is that you actually have precision, you have accuracy, you have sensitivity, you have specificity. And when you tell an individual that they may have cancer is to really kind of walk them through and say, okay, this is what your next steps are.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Great perspective, Pritesh. Thank you for telling us all about that. I want to switch gears a little bit. Obviously, the Pharmaverse podcast is a leadership podcast, and you have, 20 years of leadership. You were an AVP at Sanofi. Then you went to Alnylam in a similar role. Then you were elevated to general manager at Alnylam. If you could boil down one key to effective leadership, one key quality, What would you say it is?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's all about communication. I think I alluded to this a little bit ago, right? I think, ensuring that there's communication that's consistent with your peers, with management, internally and externally. And I think for me, articulating, the needs of the team, articulating your individual needs, articulating, how to align the goals of the team to the company to common purpose is super critical. And doing that not once a year, not doing and not doing that, semi-annually, but being deliberate about this. And it's exceptionally important to be deliberate about this as much as possible. I mean, one of the things that I've learned is there is no such thing as hypercommunication. I know it's a term, people use it, right? But I think that, the idea of ensuring that everybody's on the same page and we're all moving in the same direction at the same pace with the same timelines it's you have to do it. It's important.
So communication, one of the main keys, if not the key to effective leadership. And communication is interesting because it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
It's not one-way communication, it's listening too. This episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. Talk to us a little bit about how you feel like the value of listening is for a leader.
It's again, you're absolutely right. It is a two-way street, right? I mean, you can't just say, okay, this is unidirectional and my way or the highway. You will not have a team, right? It is important to understand other perspectives and listen to those perspectives and actually bring those perspectives out, because you don't know whether or not that different perspective could actually be a better way and a better approach of doing things. Now, you could have multiple perspectives in a table, especially when you have stakeholders that are coming from different functions, which is great. It's so important to get different perspectives. But at the end of the day, you have to come up with a unified decision of how you're going to approach a particular issue. And so I think a healthy debate, a healthy conversation about pros and cons of different perspectives is important. Put it on paper, right? Put it on a slide, and think about, okay, what is the SWOT on each perspective, right? What are the timeline implications? What is the budget implications of each perspective? And as the team kind of goes through that exercise, it becomes clearer in terms of what's the recommendation. And sometimes it's also good when you go to management with different perspectives, right? Because it actually shows that the team has thought it through in a diverse way, right? And how the team came up with a specific recommendation. And even management may actually have different ideas and thoughts as you go through those different perspectives that the team may have not thought about. So that kind of healthy back and forth is important. But you have to go in as a team with a recommendation. Not everybody is going to be able to say or agree with that recommendation, but they have to be able to understand where that recommendation came from.
Yeah, and then back it up, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and when we were talking earlier about leadership, you also talked about, there's this balance between technical skill and EQ. Talk to us a little bit about that balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, you have to, on the technical side, you have to know what you know and what you don't know and be okay with that, right? Especially when you're leading a cross-functional team. I mean, as a general manager or as a CEO, yeah, you wear different hats, right? But you cannot be a deep expert in any one area. Now, I mean, yeah, I came from the medical affairs side, so I could say I have some expertise there, right?
A lot of
But
expertise.
when you're really leading a cross-functional team that ranges from science to regulatory to clinical to commercial, market access, medical affairs, you have to be able to listen to different perspectives. And there, your technical skills are good in some areas, and then they're kind of shallow in other areas. And it's important to be able to learn. And being a general manager, being a CEO, that learning curve is super steep, right? And you kind of have to kind of drink from the fire hose, right? At times. And there are things that will not make sense to you, and it's okay to ask those questions multiple times until you feel confident about it. So I think on the EQ side, it's really kind of, listening. It's about understanding what your own limitations are and asking for help and clarification, right? And on the technical side, you kind of have to know, okay, what's the path, right? You have to, as a GM or as a CEO, you're supposed to be able to clearly articulate what your short-term path is, what your midterm path is, and what your long-term path is, right? You have to kind of agree on a target product profile for a particular product and make sure that every function has a say in that target product profile, and that is your kind of anchor in terms of where you want to go. And your operational plan will then kind of follow that target product profile.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well put. And a lot of our listeners are waiting for their chance to lead or manage a team or whatever the case may be. What advice would you give to someone that's aspiring to be a leader?
Yeah, advocate for yourself, right? That's the best thing I can say, right? And it's important, again, coming back to communication, right? And being genuine and authentic about your communication. As individuals have conversations with their managers, you know, say this is what you're aspiring for, right? And ask questions. Am I ready? What kind of skill set do you think I need? Are there training programs? When do you think I'll be ready? What do I need to do to get there, right? And have those open conversations, right? Create a path for yourself and goals for yourself, and make sure that they are written and you share them with your manager, and advocate for yourself. Leadership is fun, but initial when you're the leader for the first time, and it's also a little bit different than managing individuals. We can talk about that too, but initially there's going to be a lot of bumps, right? In terms of, okay, maybe I didn't do that right. And that's why it's so important to have right EQ, because you have to have that self-awareness of, okay, what did I do right? What did I do wrong, right? And be able to say to yourself, okay, note to self, don't do that again, right? Or be able to observe what others' styles are, and say, hey, I love that style. I'm going to try and use that style, and incorporate that in terms of my own leadership. Or even the other way around, I'm like, oh, you look at somebody else and like, I don't think that was the right thing to do in that particular circumstance. Note to self, don't do that, right? So you should have that EQ and that awareness in your surrounding and for yourself, to be a great leader. And have that conversation, as I said, to advocate for yourself with your manager.
Yeah, you brought up the difference between leading and managing. And they are different, because I love to lead and hate to manage. But usually the first person's leadership position is really a frontline management position. Any words of advice to someone who's managing people for the first time?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, leadership is really about inspiration, right? And motivation, right? And to really think about what is the common purpose for the team? What is kind of your the true north, right? And work together in true partnership and harmony, to get there, right? That's the way I kind of think about leadership. Managing people, comes along, as part of leadership, right? But that should really, if it's a true leader, that management piece should be relatively easy, because it's a dialogue, and a dialogue that is a healthy dialogue, that is authentic, that is genuine, that doesn't have any hidden agendas, and that is truly important. I mean, I think initially when folks think about leadership roles and they're also managers, it can become natural for somebody to just start micromanaging, right? And say, I want to get into the weeds, right? And why are you doing this? And why are you doing that? And this is what I would have done. And, that kind of stuff. You know, it's okay to take your time, 6 months, 8 months as a new leader to understand people, understand who they are, understand their motivations, understand how they work, understand what inspires them, right? I think it's super important to understand people before you just kind of get right into the nitty gritty. Because otherwise, when you start to lose trust with your own team and within your own team, it becomes extremely challenging.
Words of wisdom from Pritesh Gandhi. Can you believe a half hour's already gone? That's
Oh
all
my
the
God,
time
this
we
is so much
have.
fun.
Yeah, that was so much fun. And there were so many useful insights that you provided all of us. So for everyone in the Pharmaverse, we thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Michael, and it was great speaking to you again, and would love to do it again.
Yeah, that would be great. Pritesh Gandhi's a great follow on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me as well. And we have many more amazing leaders lined up for you. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and follow us on LinkedIn. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.